a lifeless body, a locked room, and too many secrets. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Vela. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments make this journey even more thrilling. Now, let's uncover the mystery. It was one of those radiant June afternoons when even the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead seemed to bask smugly in their own perfection. The lawns of Greystone Manor were in their summer glory, an immaculate stretch of green punctuated by tents, tables laden with sponge cakes and trifles, and the cheerful murmur of conversation. The annual village charity garden party was, as always, the highlight of the season, hosted by Sir Reginald Blake and his much younger wife, Lady Evelyn Miss Marple, sitting demurely beneath a parasol, sipped her tea and observed. She was fond of such gatherings, though not for the cakes or chatter. Human nature, she often said, revealed itself best when people believed themselves perfectly safe. And today, it was positively blossoming. There was Colonel Harwood, red-faced and blustering, holding forth on the incompetence of the local council. Mrs. Price, fluttering about with gossip disguised as concern, and Dr. Leonard Scott, the village physician, whose calm eyes missed very little. Near the rose-bed stood Mr. Arthur Penrose, the local solicitor, his hands clasped behind his back in habitual caution, and Mabel Turner, Lady Evelyn's maid, darting anxiously between guests with a tray of glasses. "Such a perfect day," murmured Miss Marple to her companion, Mrs. Bantry, who was resplendent in lavender, "though I dare say something will soon go amiss. It usually does when people work too hard to appear happy." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "Oh, Jane, you do have a morbid imagination." But Miss Marple merely smiled. Her knitting needles clicked softly. Across the lawn, Lady Evelyn was laughing. A laugh just a touch too bright, too rehearsed. Sir Reginald stood beside her, glass in hand, his smile more like a grimace. The tension between them was subtle, but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. At 4:30, Sir Reginald called for attention. "My friends," he began, raising his glass, "to another year of good fortune and good company." The crowd responded with polite applause, and Lady Evelyn smiled dutifully. Then, as she reached for her husband's glass to refill it, a sudden piercing scream split the air. It came from the direction of the conservatory. Guests froze. Then came the sound of breaking glass, and Colonel Harwood dropped his sandwich. Miss Marple, calm amidst the confusion, rose and made her way, surprisingly quickly for a woman of her age, toward the source of the noise. Inside the conservatory, surrounded by overturned pots and shards of glass, lay Sir Reginald Blake. His eyes stared blankly toward the ceiling, a single crimson stain spreading across his crisp white waistcoat. Lady Evelyn stood over him, trembling, a broken champagne glass at her feet. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived from the nearest town, the garden party had transformed into a tableau of whispered hysteria. No one had seen anything. Everyone had an opinion, and already rumours began to weave their delicate, poisonous threads. "Heart attack," declared Colonel Harwood confidently. "Poison," whispered Mrs. Price with relish. "An accident, surely," murmured Dr. Scott, though his brow was furrowed, and Miss Marple, standing by the conservatory door, said nothing at all. She merely looked at the position of the body, the shards of glass, the trail of spilled champagne, and one curious detail that caught her sharp blue eyes: a small smear of lipstick on the rim of Sir Reginald's glass. Not Lady Evelyn's shade, she noted absently. Too dark. That evening, as twilight softened the village and the news spread like wildfire, Miss Marple sat by her window in the vicarage, her tea growing cold beside her. She recalled the scene, the laughter, the toast, the scream. People often believed murder was born of rage, she mused, but in truth it was more often the child of resentment, of small slights and long memories. Somewhere among those smiling faces at Greystone Manor, she thought, someone had been nursing such a memory, and Miss Marple, in her gentle way, intended to find out who. Would you like me to continue with part 2, The Village Reacts, where gossip spreads and the first suspicions begin to take shape? The morning after the garden party dawned, with a peculiar stillness over St. Mary Mead. Even the sparrows seemed subdued, their usual chattering replaced by uncertain silence. The dew on the hedgerows glistened beneath a hesitant sun, and the village itself, normally a haven of domestic tranquillity, seemed to hold its breath. Everyone, from the vicar's wife to the boy who delivered the post, knew that something dreadful had happened at Greystone Manor. By breakfast, the details, real and imagined, were already making their rounds. At the Blue Boar Inn, where villagers often gathered for morning tea and gossip disguised as civic concern, the talk was already in full swing. Mrs. Price, who had been first to see the ambulance the night before, was holding court at the centre table, her voice low, yet carrying through the room with the confidence of one who knows she is being listened to. "I tell you, it wasn't an accident," she said, leaning in conspiratorially. "Dr. Scott might say heart failure, but I've seen enough sudden deaths to know when something isn't quite natural. And that poor Lady Evelyn, she looked half-crazed, screaming one moment, fainting the next. It's enough to make you wonder what goes on behind those fine curtains." Now, Mrs. Price," interrupted Mr. Penrose, the solicitor, his tone calm but cautious. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Sir Reginald was not a young man, after all. A man of his age and constitution might easily have collapsed from excitement." "Excitement?" Mrs. Price snorted. "You call that excitement? More like divine justice, if you ask me." Mr. Penrose frowned but said nothing. Across the room, Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual corner, a modest pot of tea before her, knitting needles poised, but momentarily forgotten. She did not look up, though she was listening intently. She had long learned that gossip, however inaccurate in detail, often revealed deeper truths in tone. Mrs. Price's sharpness towards Sir Reginald, for example, spoke of long-standing disapproval, and her claim of divine justice hinted at something personal, perhaps some grievance or memory not yet aired. She took a sip of her tea and glanced out the window. The road to Greystone Manor was already busy with visitors, some official, others not. The inquest, she knew, would be held soon. Inspector Craddock would want to appear methodical, though she suspected he was already being pressured to deliver quick answers. The Blakes were prominent after all, and scandal in such circles was never welcomed. When Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she found a note slipped under her door, written in a hurried, nervous hand. "Dear Miss Marple, forgive my boldness, but I must speak with you at once. Please, if you might come after luncheon. I am not at liberty to go out. Yours, M.T. Mabel Turner," she thought immediately. The maid, the initials confirmed it. Miss Marple folded the note neatly, her brows drawing together slightly. It was not uncommon for servants to seek her counsel, especially when their employers' troubles threatened to sweep them into ruin. Still, the urgency in the writing suggested something more serious than mere worry about her position. By the time Miss Marple arrived at Greystone Manor that afternoon, the house had changed. The gaiety of the previous day had vanished, leaving behind a heavy air of dread. Curtains were drawn, Footsteps echoed in hushed tones, and the faint scent of lilies drifted through the hall. Someone had already sent flowers of condolence. Mabel met her at the side door, her face pale and drawn. "Thank you for coming, ma'am," she whispered. "I didn't know who else to turn to." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, following her into the narrow servants' corridor. "You were quite right to send for me. It's a dreadful business for everyone, I'm sure. Now tell me what troubles you." Mabel clasped her hands tightly. "It's Lady Evelyn, ma'am. She's been in her room since it happened, refusing to see anyone but the doctor. And there's talk downstairs, ugly talk, that she and Sir Reginald argued just before the toast." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "People do say things in the heat of excitement. But you believe otherwise?" The girl hesitated. "Yes, ma'am. I was in the drawing-room fetching the extra glasses when I heard them. He said something about a letter, something that had come that morning. She begged him not to make a scene. Then the bell rang for tea, and they went out as if nothing had happened." "A letter, you say?" "Yes, ma'am. From London, I think. The butler brought it up with the noon post. Sir Reginald looked furious when he read it." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "And did you see what became of it?" "No, ma'am. I think he put it in his pocket." That small detail, Miss Marple thought, might prove rather important. Letters often did in her experience. She thanked Mabel gently and left her with a word of comfort. As she stepped out onto the gravel path, she noticed Inspector Craddock emerging from the study, his hat in hand and expression grave. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, acknowledging her with a tired smile. "I might have guessed you'd be here. I suppose half the village has already reached its own verdict." "Oh, yes," she replied mildly. "Mrs. Price is certain of poison, while Colonel Harwood prefers apoplexy. Mrs. Bantry leans toward romantic tragedy. I do admire how efficient people are when others are dead, don't you?" Craddock chuckled despite himself. "Well, I'd prefer something a bit more substantial. The doctor's report confirms death by digitalis poisoning, found in the champagne glass, of all places." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly, though her voice remained calm. "Digitalis? How very curious. Not easily obtained without some knowledge, I imagine." "Quite right. We're looking into the source. Dr. Scott prescribed it recently for an elderly patient, but the bottle's accounted for. We're also checking the chemist's shop." He paused, studying her. "You wouldn't have any impressions, would you?" "Only that appearances are deceptive, as they so often are," she said softly. "May I ask, was anything unusual found among Sir Reginald's effects?" Craddock frowned. "Unusual? Only a letter burnt halfway through in the grate. We could just make out part of a signature before it turned to ash. R. Denby, I think." "Ah," said Miss Marple, her eyes distant. "That name seems faintly familiar." She left the manor deep in thought. R. Denby. It stirred something in her memory. A scandal years ago involving a young officer and a missing inheritance, though she couldn't yet recall the details. As she reached the end of the lane, she encountered Dr. Scott, coming from his surgery, his face drawn. "Terrible business," he murmured. "I never liked the man, mind you, but no one deserves that end. Lady Evelyn is in a fragile state. I fear for her nerves." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Poor child. Grief can make the living behave in strange ways. Tell me, Doctor, was Sir Reginald in good health otherwise?" "Physically, yes, but he suffered from strain, financial and emotional. There were rumours his investments had gone badly. And his marriage." He hesitated. "Let's just say it was not entirely harmonious. She married him for security, I believe, and he her for appearance." "I see," said Miss Marple quietly. "Then both got rather less than they bargained for." That evening, as dusk settled over the village, the vicar called upon Miss Marple. ostensibly to discuss the forthcoming charity bazaar, but inevitably steering toward the tragedy. Dreadful thing, Jane. One can hardly believe such evil could strike so near home. Do you think it was deliberate? I fear so, she said softly. Poison seldom administers itself. But you know, Mr. Clement, I can't help feeling that the answer will not be found in chemistry or fingerprints, but in something far simpler, human pride. He looked puzzled, but Miss Marple only smiled faintly and poured another cup of tea. She was thinking of Lady Evelyn's trembling hands, of the letter burned in the grate, and of a certain name whispered from the past, R. Denby. Somewhere among those pieces lay the truth, waiting quietly, as truths so often did, for someone patient enough to see it. The next morning brought another ripple of excitement to St. Mary Mead. Lady Evelyn Blake had been formally questioned and was to remain at Greystone under supervision. The village, ever eager for drama, was divided, half convinced of her guilt, half insisting she was too delicate and beautiful to commit such a crime. Miss Marple, however, thought neither view sufficient. She spent the morning in her garden, pruning her roses and reflecting. There was, she decided, a pattern emerging, not yet clear, but unmistakable, and as she snipped a wilted bloom and laid it aside, she murmured softly, "People so seldom realize how very revealing small acts can be. A letter burned, a glass misplaced, a shade of lipstick that does not belong. One must look at the little things, for they are always the truest." She glanced toward the distant silhouette of Greystone Manor, the grand house now shadowed by suspicion, and felt the quiet certainty that the affair was far from over. Miss Marple always found that the most revealing hours in a village were the quiet ones, when the morning's gossip had cooled into reflective silence. The day after Lady Evelyn's questioning, the sun hung pale behind a veil of thin clouds, and the air carried the heavy scent of rain on its way. She had just finished breakfast when the familiar sound of the gate latch clicked open, followed by hurried footsteps on the path. It was Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed with the thrill of fresh information. "My dear Jane," she exclaimed, lowering her voice though there was no one else in sight, "you'll never believe what I've just heard from the milkman. They say Inspector Craddock has found the chemist's book. Someone purchased Digitalis under a false name last week." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her expression mild but attentive. "Oh, and who, pray, is the supposed culprit today?" Mrs. Bantry perched on the edge of the chair, eyes gleaming. "None other than Lady Evelyn herself. Imagine it, Jane, her of all people. The chemist says a lady matching her description came in, heavily veiled, asking for something to help her heart. Of course, the whole thing could be mistaken identity, but really, how suspicious." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, quite suspicious. Yet I wonder, did the chemist also happen to mention which hand the lady used to sign the register?" Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Her hand? Why, what difference does that make?" "Oh, a small one, perhaps. But I've found that people's habits betray them more than their words." She set her knitting aside and reached for her hat. "I think I might take a turn through the village. It's a good day for errands, don't you think?" Within the hour, Miss Marple was walking the cobbled High Street, exchanging gentle greetings with shopkeepers, who pretended to be calm, while clearly buzzing with curiosity. When she entered the chemist's shop, Mr. Simmons, the proprietor, a nervous man with thinning hair and spectacles perched precariously on his nose, nearly dropped the bottle he was labelling. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he stammered. "Terrible business, terrible. Poor Sir Reginald, such a shock." "Yes, indeed," she agreed softly, resting her gloved hand on the counter. I dare say you've had your fair share of inquiries lately. The inspector must have asked quite a lot about that unfortunate purchase." Mr. Simmons's face grew red. "Oh, I shouldn't talk about it, ma'am. Confidential, you know." Of course," she said gently. "Still, you must have felt uneasy, selling something as dangerous as digitalis, without knowing the true nature of your customer. One can hardly blame you for being deceived. I understand she wore gloves. Gloves? Why, yes, dark ones, and a heavy veil too. Said she was the vicar's cousin, passing through from Bath. Had a sort of refined way of speaking, but nervous. Wrote the name down in a bold hand. Left-handed, I think. Left-handed, I think. Left-handed, Miss Marple repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly. Curious. Lady Evelyn, as I recall, is quite decidedly right-handed. She embroiders beautifully, you know. Mr. Simmons blinked. Oh, well, perhaps I was mistaken. The inspector did say the description fit rather loosely. I dare say it did, Miss Marple murmured. Thank you, Mr. Simmons. You've been most helpful. As she stepped back into the cool air, a shadow fell across the pavement. Inspector Craddock was just crossing the street toward her, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He greeted her with a half-smile, though his eyes carried the weary scepticism of a man besieged by conflicting evidence. I thought I might find you here, he said. You've a habit of turning up where threads begin to tangle. I prefer to think I turn up where they might be untangled, she replied pleasantly. Have you discovered anything new? Too much, and none of it clear. Lady Evelyn denies any knowledge of the poison, of course, but the circumstantial evidence is stacking up. She had opportunity, motive. There are whispers of a quarrel over money. And now this chemist's statement. Miss Marple's expression softened. Ah, yes, whispers. They do have a way of growing louder until they drown out the truth entirely. Tell me, Inspector, has anyone considered that the poison might have been meant for her? Craddock blinked. For her? You think she was the intended victim? I think, she said thoughtfully, that people sometimes mistake the direction in which mischief travels. Sir Reginald had many enemies, some perhaps too polite to call themselves that. And if someone believed Lady Evelyn might share her husband's drink, she let the implication hang delicately in the air. The inspector frowned. You've a way of making the impossible sound sensible, Miss Marple. But if not her, then who? The servants? Dr. Scott? Penrose, the solicitor? None of them had anything to gain. Oh, Inspector, she said gently, people seldom act for gain alone. Pride, jealousy, fear, these are much stronger currencies. He gave a rueful laugh. You should be running the investigation, not I. Goodness, no, she said lightly. I'm far too fond of my garden. When she reached home later that afternoon, Miss Marple found a visitor waiting, a young man with neatly combed hair and the unmistakable air of someone uncomfortable in another's drawing-room. He stood up as she entered. Miss Marple, forgive the intrusion. My name is Richard Denby. The name struck her instantly. She gestured for him to sit, her tone calm, though her pulse quickened. Denby, how interesting. I believe I heard mention of your name in connection with Sir Reginald just recently. Yes, he admitted, clasping his hands tightly. I believe my letter to him might have precipitated what happened. I didn't mean for any of this. She tilted her head slightly. You wrote the letter found partially burned in his study then. I did, he said. Years ago, Sir Reginald was executor of my father's estate. There were discrepancies. I only recently discovered how much money was never accounted for. I wrote demanding he explain himself. He replied with silence. I thought to confront him in person, but before I could, well, you know the rest. Miss Marple watched him closely. Did anyone else know of your letter? No, not even my aunt, with whom I'm staying in Market Chipping. And yet someone knew enough to fear it. she murmured, almost to herself. "Tell me, Mr. Denby, were you acquainted with Lady Evelyn?" "Only slightly," he said, frowning. "I met her once years ago, before her marriage. My mother was fond of her, thought her charming but foolish." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "of foolishness in the young often becomes secrecy in the married." After he left, she sat for a long while by the window, watching the first drops of rain tap against the glass. A young man wronged, a letter burned, a dead husband, and a wife too fragile or too shrewd to protest too loudly. The picture was forming, but certain strokes were missing. That evening, she received an unexpected call from Dr. Scott, who sounded uneasy. "Miss Marple, I thought you should know. The inspector asked me to review Sir Reginald's medical records. There's something odd. The man had no prescription for digitalis, but his personal bottle of tonic shows traces of it. Someone had been adding small doses for weeks, perhaps months." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the receiver. So it was not a sudden act, then? No, it was planned, gradual, but whoever did it miscalculated the final dose. Too much, too quickly. "Thank you, Doctor. That's most enlightening." After replacing the receiver, she sat in silence. Someone had been poisoning Sir Reginald long before the garden party. The champagne was merely the final flourish. A convenient stage for a death already set in motion. And whoever that someone was had both patience and opportunity. Two qualities that rarely belonged to passion alone. She rose, crossed to her writing desk, and took up her notebook, jotting down the names that had surfaced like fragments of glass. Lady Evelyn, Mabel Turner, Dr. Scott, Arthur Penrose, Richard Denby. Then, beneath them all, she wrote one simple word: motive. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the hills, and Miss Marple, listening to its distant rumble, felt that same warning echo within her mind. Something was still hidden at Greystone Manor. Something that no chemist's book or autopsy could reveal. It was not a question of who had access to the poison, but who had understood human weakness well enough to use it. And that, she thought, narrowing her eyes toward the shadowed village beyond her window, was a question she intended to answer. The next morning broke clear and still, as though the storm had taken with it the worst of the village's unrest. But Miss Marple knew better. St. Mary Mead's surface calm, much like the polished silver at a tea-table, only reflected what one wanted to see. Beneath it, the residue of fear and speculation was thickening. She had slept little, her thoughts circling the same quiet certainty that the pieces of the puzzle were there. Only the order was wrong. Someone had been playing a careful game, one designed not merely to deceive the police, but to misdirect everyone's sense of motive and timing. When she stepped out into her garden, she found Inspector Craddock leaning against her gate, his hat tipped back, looking faintly harassed. "Miss Marple," he said with a half-grimace, "I was on my way to see you. You've been ahead of me before, and I thought perhaps you'd save me the trouble of a few blind alleys." "Such efficiency," she said pleasantly, motioning him inside. "You mustn't flatter me, Inspector. It gives one ideas above one's station. But I suppose you've come about the Denby boy?" Craddock raised an eyebrow as they sat at her kitchen table. "So you know about him already?" "Yes, he came by the station yesterday evening. Swore he had nothing to do with Blake's death. But his letter certainly stirred things up. And now, this morning, we've discovered something new. Sir Reginald's bank account. Quite a few transfers to a name we can't trace. Our Denby, again. It looks as though he'd been paying the fellow off for years." Miss Marple poured tea, her eyes thoughtful. How curious! Yet Mr. Denby's manner struck me as sincere. The guilty rarely volunteer information unprompted, don't you think? "No, I imagine those payments were not for blackmail, but for conscience. Sir Reginald had a habit of making reparations privately when his conscience troubled him. At least, that's what people like him do, if they have a conscience left. Craddock looked doubtful. So you believe the payments were to ease guilt, not silence? Perhaps both, though not in the way you suspect. If I'm correct, Sir Reginald wronged someone long before this. Someone who learned how to turn remorse into advantage. That sort of arrangement always ends badly, Inspector. He leaned back, folding his arms. You've a theory, then? I have the beginning of one. Tell me, did you find out anything further about that bottle of tonic Dr. Scott mentioned? Yes, it's been sent for analysis, but it was likely tampered with over time. The servants all deny touching it. Mabel Turner says she dusted around it once a week, but never opened it. Lady Evelyn claims she didn't even know he kept it in the cabinet by his bed. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet she was the one who fetched him that tonic most evenings, was she not? Craddock's eyes sharpened. You're implying she lied? Not necessarily. People often separate what they do from what they know. It eases the conscience. I dare say Lady Evelyn never asked questions about what was in the bottle, because she didn't want to know the answer. To know the answer. To know. Craddock sighed, rubbing his temple. You're saying she may have suspected something but didn't act. Precisely. But she may not be the only one. I think we're dealing with more than a single deception here. The poisoner may not have meant Sir Reginald to die so soon, or perhaps not at all. Sometimes, you know, a plan shifts without its author realizing. The inspector looked up sharply, but Miss Marple only smiled, setting down her cup. You'll think me fanciful, of course, but if you'd be so kind, Inspector, I should like to call on Lady Evelyn this afternoon, purely as a neighbourly gesture. I promise to keep to polite topics. Craddock hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. All right, but don't push her too far. The doctor says she's near breaking point. Miss Marple merely inclined her head. I never push, Inspector, I observe. That afternoon, the great doors of Greyston Manor opened to her once again, though the hall beyond seemed more mausoleum than home. The butler, his composure strained, led her to the drawing-room where Lady Evelyn sat by the window, dressed in grey silk and looking pale enough to vanish into the light. The smell of lavender hung faintly in the air, too strong, as though used to mask something sharper. My dear Lady Evelyn, Miss Marple began softly, I'm so sorry to intrude. I thought perhaps a little company might be a comfort. Lady Evelyn managed a wan smile. You're kind, Miss Marple. The days have been very long since it happened. I can quite imagine. A shock like that unsettles everything, doesn't it? One begins to see even ordinary things as suspect. I remember when poor Colonel Hargreaves died suddenly. His wife couldn't bear the sight of the garden tools for weeks afterward. Lady Evelyn's hands twisted in her lap. Yes, everything feels wrong somehow. I can't sleep. And the servants whisper when they think I don't hear. I suppose they believe I poisoned him. Miss Marple regarded her gently. People do love a villain they can recognize. It's so much tidier than facing the unknown. There was a silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Then Lady Evelyn spoke again, almost in a whisper. He wasn't kind to me, Miss Marple. I don't say that to excuse anything, only to make you understand. Sir Reginald could be cruel in small ways. He liked power, even in marriage. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Yes, my dear, many men of his generation did. It must have been lonely for you. Lady Evelyn looked up sharply, her eyes glistening. Lonely? I thought I'd made peace with it. But lately, before he died, there was something else. Letters coming, secretive phone calls, nights when he locked himself in the study. I tried to ask once, but he told me to mind my place. Letters again, Miss Marple murmured. Would any of them have been from Mr. Denby? Evelyn blinked. Denby? No, I don't think so. Wait, she hesitated. One envelope had that name, yes. But it wasn't his handwriting, not the one I saw. It was neater, precise, almost feminine. Miss Marple felt a flicker of recognition. And you're certain it was Denby's name on the envelope? Yes, I saw it when he left it on the desk. He burned it later, I think. Curious, Miss Marple said softly, her gaze distant. Very curious indeed. As she left the manor, her mind was turning over this new detail like a coin between fingers. A feminine hand? Someone pretending to be Denby, perhaps? Or using his name for another purpose entirely? Such things had been done before. At the gate, she nearly collided with Mabel Turner, who was returning from the village with a basket of provisions. The girl looked pale and frightened. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you. I was well, Lady Evelyn's not been eating properly, so I thought some fresh bread might tempt her." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "That's very thoughtful of you, my dear. You've been under quite a strain yourself, I imagine." Mabel's eyes darted toward the house. "It's been awful, ma'am. The inspector keeps asking questions, and the others look at me like I know something. But I don't. Only," she hesitated, lowering her voice, "yesterday I found something odd in the laundry, among Sir Reginald's things. A handkerchief with a dark stain. Not blood, but something like ink or medicine. I meant to throw it out, but may I see it?" The girl nodded and handed over a folded piece of linen from her apron pocket. Miss Marple examined it delicately. Faint traces of brownish residue marked the fabric's edge, and beneath it, embroidered initials. "M.T. Yours?" she asked softly. Mabel's face went white. "Yes, ma'am. But I swear I never. He must have used it himself. I sometimes left them by his tray." "I quite believe you, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, tucking the cloth into her handbag. "And you were right not to destroy it. Little things are often far more telling than big ones." When she returned home, the twilight had already settled in, painting the hedgerows in silver. She lit her lamp and laid the handkerchief on the table beside her notes. The pattern was emerging more clearly now. Someone had been administering the poison subtly over time, using something that passed easily through many hands. A bottle, a cloth, a glass, and when the final opportunity arose at the garden party, they had taken it, confident that suspicion would fall neatly on another. As she watched the small flame flicker in the lamp, Miss Marple thought of the delicate embroidery on the handkerchief, the feminine handwriting on the false Denby letter, and the lipstick on Sir Reginald's glass that had not belonged to Lady Evelyn. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. It was all beginning to fit, though not yet completely. There remained one piece she needed, one small truth to confirm the rest, and for that she would need to watch very carefully indeed. People she knew always revealed themselves when they thought the worst was past. That night, the wind shifted again, sweeping in from the hills with a soft sigh that rustled through the ivy on the vicarage walls. Miss Marple, seated by her fire, watched the last ember sink into ash and reflected on the curious chain of details that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to align. Each fragment, a letter with a woman's hand, a handkerchief marked with Mabel's initials, the lipstick on the champagne glass, and the slow, patient poisoning, all pointed towards something far more intricate than the inspector imagined. The truth she sensed was not in the open at all, but buried in the quiet rituals of daily life, those small and repetitive acts where deceit could hide most easily. The next morning brought with it a brittle sort of calm. The gossip in St. Mary Mead had settled into patterns of certainty. Those who pitied Lady Evelyn and those who condemned her outright. At the grocer's, Miss Marple heard Mrs. Price declare with satisfaction that a woman like that, with her airs and delicate nerves, was bound to snap sooner or later. The shopkeeper nodded solemnly, as though moral balance had been restored by tragedy. Miss Marple, selecting her sugar and tea with her usual deliberation, thought privately how swiftly a community decided guilt when it was convenient. As she stepped outside, she saw Dr. Scott approaching along the road. His hat was pulled low, and he looked tired, as if sleep had been a luxury lately denied him. When he caught sight of her, he slowed and greeted her with a weary nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone low, "you always seem to know more than the rest of us. I wonder, could I trouble you for a word?" "Of course, Doctor. Perhaps we might walk as we talk. Fresh air does wonders for one's thoughts." He fell into step beside her, his hands clasped behind his back. "The inquest is set for next week," he said. "Craddock's certain the poison was deliberate, but I keep turning something over in my mind, something that doesn't fit. The analysis confirmed what I suspected. Sir Reginald had been receiving small doses for weeks, maybe months. Whoever did this knew his habits intimately." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "Someone who could act without notice. The poisoner wasn't rushing. They were waiting for something, or perhaps for someone." Dr. Scott glanced at her. "You think the death wasn't the real aim?" "I think," she replied, "that Sir Reginald's death served more than one purpose. It silenced him, yes, but it also cast suspicion exactly where the killer wanted it. A most efficient arrangement. They walked in silence for a while, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Then the doctor spoke again, more hesitantly. "There's something else. The night before the garden party, Sir Reginald called on me. He asked for more digitalis, though I told him quite firmly I couldn't oblige. He wasn't one of my patients. He said he needed it for an experiment. Something about the effects of small doses on the heart. I refused, naturally. He looked furious. I thought he might strike me." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Curious indeed. And yet the next morning he was perfectly composed at the party." "Too composed," Scott said grimly. "It was as if he'd made peace with something. I can't help feeling he knew what was coming." "Or who was bringing it?" Miss Marple murmured. The doctor looked at her sharply. "You have an idea, don't you?" "I have a suspicion," she said with a faint smile. "But suspicion, you know, is only the seed. One must wait to see what grows from it." When she returned home, a note was waiting on her doorstep. The handwriting was elegant, looping, and unmistakably female. "Miss Marple, if you value the truth, and I think you do, please come to the summer house behind Greystone at dusk. I cannot speak openly here. They're watching me." Miss Marple read the note twice, her brow furrowing. The handwriting was steady, but bore the tremor of fear. Dusk, she thought, was an odd choice of time for a frightened young woman to seek a meeting, and odder still to arrange it in so exposed a place. Yet Mabel Turner had trusted her once already, and if the girl was desperate enough to risk this, it might be something worth hearing. She arrived at Greystone as the evening light thinned to silver, the air thick with the scent of lilac. The grounds were quiet. A lone gardener's spade leaned forgotten against the wall, and somewhere a blackbird sang its last song before nightfall. The summer house stood at the far edge of the garden, half hidden by overgrown shrubs, its windows reflecting the faint glow from the house. "Mabel," she called softly as she stepped inside. There was no answer, only the faint rustle of the wind through the vines. On the table lay a single folded paper weighted by a small stone. Miss Marple approached carefully, her heart tightening. She unfolded the note. "Forgive me. I cannot stay. I was wrong to trust them. They know. No signature this time. Only, beneath the hurried words, a faint smudge of something brownish. like soil, or perhaps dried tonic residue. Miss Marple stood very still, then turned sharply toward the house. A light flickered briefly in one of the upper windows, the same window that belonged to Sir Reginald's old study. Someone was there, watching. She slipped the note into her handbag and made her way quietly back to the lane, her mind already racing ahead. If Mabel had written this, she was either in hiding or silenced. Either way, the hand that guided her fear was not her own. Someone within that house was manipulating every thread of this web, ensuring each clue pointed toward another victim. Later that evening, Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's door, his expression grim. "We've found Mabel Turner," he said without preamble, "down by the river. Alive, but barely. Looks like she fell or was pushed. She's at the surgery now." Miss Marple's face remained calm, though her voice dropped to a whisper. "She's alive? Thank heaven. I must see her, Inspector. Now." At the surgery, the girl lay pale and motionless beneath the lamplight, a thin bandage around her forehead. Dr. Scott nodded silently as Miss Marple entered. "She'll live, but she's shaken. Head wound, nothing more serious. Shocked out of her wits, poor thing." Miss Marple took the girl's hand gently. "Mabel, my dear, it's Miss Marple. You're safe now." Her eyelids fluttered and her voice came in a faint whisper. "I didn't mean to go. I wanted to tell you. I saw her near the study that night. The letter, she burned it herself." "Who, my dear? Who burned it?" The girl's breath caught, and her hand tightened weakly. "Lady Evelyn," she murmured. "But it wasn't her poison. It wasn't her at all. It was—" Her voice trailed off, and she sank back into exhausted silence. Miss Marple sat still for a long time, the girl's words echoing in her mind. Lady Evelyn had burned the letter, but not out of guilt, out of fear. Someone else had orchestrated this. Someone who stood to gain both from Sir Reginald's death and from the ruin of his wife. When she finally left the surgery, the moon hung low over the village, pale and watchful. The streets were empty, the cottages dark. She walked slowly, deep in thought, the pieces rearranging themselves at last into a pattern that made dreadful sense. The handkerchief, the handwriting, the lipstick, the false purchases, all the quiet manipulations that had guided suspicion from one person to the next. She thought of Dr. Scott, steady, compassionate, always conveniently present at every turn, his voice the one of reason and calm, a man with access to medicines, a man who had known the Blakes intimately, and a man, she now recalled, whose late wife had once been Evelyn's closest friend before her sudden death 2 years prior. By the time Miss Marple reached her gate, the first light of dawn was streaking the sky. She paused there, her hand resting lightly on the latch, and whispered to herself, "It's always the heart, isn't it? The kind heart that grows possessive, the wounded heart that seeks revenge. Not greed, not gain, but love turned sour." Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay Dr. Scott another visit, but not for tea. The morning rose pale and chill, the kind of dawn that dulled even the church bells to a hesitant echo. Miss Marple stood by her window, the teapot untouched beside her, her thoughts threading carefully through the night's revelations. Sleep had eluded her. Instead, she had spent the small hours reviewing every word, every gesture, every misplaced kindness that had passed before her since that fateful garden party. The pattern was clear now, though one final thread remained to be drawn tight. She had seen at last the hand behind the slow, merciless design of Sir Reginald's death. And the tragedy was that it had not been born of hatred, but of something more dangerous, love. When Inspector Craddock arrived just after 9, he looked as though he had not slept either. His usually neat hair was rumpled, and the lines around his mouth had deepened. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said grimly. "Mabel's awake, but she's confused. Can't remember much beyond falling near the riverbank. Still insists Lady Evelyn burned that letter, though." "She did," Miss Marple said softly, "but not for the reason you think." She poured him tea, her tone measured. "You see, Inspector, when one loves someone desperately enough, one does foolish things to protect them, even when one suspects the truth." Craddock frowned. "You're suggesting Lady Evelyn was shielding someone else?" "I am, but not out of romantic loyalty. Out of fear and gratitude, a most uneasy mixture." He looked at her warily. "Go on." Miss Marple folded her hands, the faintest tremor in her voice. "I have been thinking of the slow poisoning. It began long before the party, did it not? Administered in small doses, cleverly masked within Sir Reginald's own tonic. That required patience, skill, and access to medicine. Qualities not easily found outside a professional's hands." Craddock's expression hardened. "You're speaking of Dr. Scott." "I am," she said simply. "And before you dismiss it, consider this. He was the only one who could have provided digitalis without question. He knew its dosage intimately. He also had the perfect pretext for entering the house at any hour, especially as he'd been attending to Lady Evelyn's nerves. He could have slipped the smallest amount into Sir Reginald's mixture each time he visited. Then, when the final opportunity came, the toast at the garden party, he let the poison do its work, knowing everyone's attention would turn to the lady beside the glass." Craddock exhaled sharply. "But why, Miss Marple? Why would he do such a thing? Scott's a respected man. There's nothing to tie him personally to Sir Reginald except the occasional visit." "Ah," she said softly, "that's where memory is useful. You see, 2 years ago, Dr. Scott's wife died unexpectedly. Heart failure, they said. But before her marriage, she had been Evelyn's dearest friend. Sir Reginald was her cousin and, by all accounts, disapproved of the match. There were rumours, quiet ones, of course, that he interfered with their finances, left Scott humiliated and dependent. A proud man, the doctor. Such wounds fester silently. And when Evelyn later married the same man who'd ruined him, it must have reopened everything he'd buried." Craddock stared into his teacup. "Revenge, then. Revenge carefully disguised as benevolence," Miss Marple said. "He comforted Lady Evelyn, visited her often, treated her for imagined ailments, all the while convincing her that her husband's temper, his erratic health, were the natural results of strain. I dare say she grew to depend on him, even trust him implicitly. So when he finally persuaded her to burn that letter, to protect her husband's reputation, he said, she did it without question. She believed she was saving him from scandal, when in truth she was erasing evidence of a murder already in progress." Craddock's jaw tightened. "That's a grave accusation, a grave accusation, a grave "Indeed," she agreed, "which is why I'd rather not accuse at all. But I believe you'll find proof if you look carefully enough. Mabel's handkerchief. The residue upon it was likely the same compound as the doctored tonic. Dr. Scott, I suspect, handled it himself while delivering one of his little prescriptions, and later returned it by mistake. He may have thought the stain unremarkable, but he underestimates how very telling a trifle can be." The inspector rose, pacing before the hearth. "If what you're saying is true, Miss Marple, he's been playing us all for fools. But how do we catch a man like that? He's cautious, intelligent. He won't confess easily." "No," she said, her eyes glinting with quiet resolve. "But he will reveal himself when he believes no one is watching. You must let me speak with him first. He trusts me, or rather, he thinks me harmless. That is always an advantage. Craddock hesitated. I don't like it, Miss Marple. It's dangerous. Everything worth doing is, Inspector, she replied gently. Besides, he will not harm me. I remind him too much of his conscience. By late afternoon, the village lay under a thick grey sky. The first drops of rain began to fall as Miss Marple made her way to Dr. Scott's surgery, a modest building at the end of the High Street. The light in the window glowed warmly, and inside she found the doctor seated behind his desk, a book open before him. He looked up, startled, but quickly smiled. Miss Marple! What a pleasant surprise! I was just reviewing some patient notes. Poor Mabel's recovery is going well, though she'll need rest. I'm very glad to hear it, Miss Marple said, removing her gloves with deliberate care. I thought I might trouble you for a few moments of your time. There's something I wish to understand. He gestured to a chair. Of course, anything I can do. She sat, her eyes never leaving his face. It's about Sir Reginald. I find myself puzzled, you see. Such a proud, vigorous man to fall so suddenly. It doesn't sit right. And the poison, of course, was digitalis. I believe you told Inspector Craddock you had recently prescribed it for another patient. Yes, he said evenly. An elderly woman in Much Benham. Quite routine. Ah, but tell me, Doctor, if Sir Reginald had approached you for digitalis, would you have refused him? He hesitated. Naturally. It's dangerous in untrained hands. Dangerous indeed, she said softly, especially in the hands of one who knows how to disguise its effects. Something flickered in his eyes, too brief to be called fear, too practised to be guilt. I'm not sure I take your meaning. Oh, but you do, Miss Marple said gently, and I think you've known for some time that the tonic in Sir Reginald's cabinet was not quite what it seemed, and I think you relied upon Lady Evelyn's ignorance to keep it that way. You might even have told yourself you were doing her a kindness, freeing her from a cruel marriage. But murder, Dr. Scott, is never an act of mercy, however kindly it begins. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is absurd. You come here accusing me without a shred of proof. An old woman's fantasies. Miss Marple rose as well, calm and composed. Perhaps, but fantasy has a curious way of becoming fact when tested. You see, Inspector Craddock is waiting just outside with the chemist's report. They've confirmed that the residue on Mabel's handkerchief matches the compound found in Sir Reginald's tonic, and that the mixture was prepared using a measuring spoon from your own dispensary. For a moment there was only silence. Then the doctor's shoulders sagged. He sank into his chair, covering his face with his hands. He ruined everything, he murmured. My wife, my career, my peace. I only wanted him to suffer as I had. Slowly, quietly. I never meant for her to be blamed. Miss Marple's voice was almost tender. But she was, you see, and that's what evil always does. It spreads beyond its target. When Craddock entered moments later, the doctor made no resistance. He went quietly, like a man who had already confessed long ago and was only now being heard. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. The rain had ceased, and the garden glistened in the lamplight. She poured herself a small cup of tea and sat by the fire, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. There was no satisfaction in the outcome, only a melancholy peace, another crime, another truth unmasked, and yet always the same lesson whispered through the stillness of St. Mary Mead, that the most dangerous poison of all was not in any bottle, but in the human heart when love curdled into revenge. Outside the night deepened. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully, then smiled faintly to herself. Tomorrow, she decided, she would visit Lady Evelyn. Perhaps bring her some lavender for comfort. After all, wounds of the heart required gentler medicine than any doctor could provide. The morning after Dr. Scott's arrest dawned with an almost unsettling serenity. The village, which had hummed with gossip and speculation for days, now lay hushed, as if the stillness itself were trying to absorb what had been uncovered. In St. Mary Mead, even scandal had its limits. And this one, poison, passion, and betrayal wrapped in polite civility, seemed to exhaust everyone's appetite for talk. Yet beneath the calm, Miss Marple sensed something unfinished. She had learned long ago that human wickedness rarely ended neatly. It left echoes, faint and troubling, that lingered long after justice had been served. She sat at her breakfast table, the newspaper open before her. The headlines were as expected. Local physician confesses to murder of prominent landowner. But it was the smaller print beneath that held her gaze. The article claimed Dr. Scott had confessed freely, accepting responsibility for the poisonings, yet denying intent to kill. It quoted him saying only, "I meant to cure a sickness that could not be treated by medicine." Miss Marple folded the paper thoughtfully. Such a phrase, so carefully chosen, struck her as peculiar. It sounded less like remorse and more like a riddle. The clock chimed 8, and as she reached for her shawl, she heard a soft knock at the door. When she opened it, Lady Evelyn stood there pale as frost and visibly trembling. She wore a black coat too heavy for the season, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "may I come in?" "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, leading her to the parlour. "You must sit down. You look quite spent." Evelyn sank into the armchair by the fire, clasping her gloved hands. "I've hardly slept," she said. "I keep hearing his voice, Dr. Scott's, I mean. Even after everything, I can't believe he was capable of such cruelty." Miss Marple poured tea with deliberate calm. "Cruelty often hides itself behind care, my dear. The most dangerous poisoners are those who believe themselves kind." Evelyn looked up sharply. "You sound as if you doubt the case is over." "I never doubt the law's ability to close a case," Miss Marple said mildly. "But truth, you see, is sometimes less obedient. I find myself wondering what Dr. Scott truly meant by his final words." Evelyn hesitated, her voice barely audible. "He visited me yesterday before they took him away. He asked to see me privately. Inspector Craddock allowed it, though only for a few minutes." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And what did he say?" Evelyn's eyes glistened. "He said he had saved me, that now I could be free. I told him I never asked to be saved, that I would have rather lived in unhappiness than owe my peace to death. He smiled, oh, Miss Marple, it was terrible, and said I would understand in time. Then he asked if I still had the key to Sir Reginald's writing desk." Miss Marple froze, her teacup halfway to her lips. "The key?" "Yes," Evelyn said, trembling. "I had forgotten all about it. The desk was locked after the police search, and I assumed they'd taken everything. But last night I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. So I went to the study. The lock was stiff, but it opened, and inside I found this." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with a dark smear of wax. Across the front was written in an unfamiliar, angular hand, "To be opened in the event of my death. Event of my death. Event." Miss Marple took it delicately, studying the writing. "This is not Sir Reginald's handwriting, nor Dr. Scott's. Do you recognize it?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, but inside there's a single sheet. I haven't read it." "I was afraid." Miss Marple gave a small, reassuring smile. "Then let us read it together." She broke the seal with care and unfolded the paper. The writing was spare, deliberate, the ink slightly faded. "Sir Reginald, you think your secrets will remain buried, But truth is not so easily suffocated. You ruined a life once to preserve your own, and now the debt will be collected. The heart you broke has found another to beat in its stead. When your time comes, remember the name, Mary Scott." For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The fire crackled softly in the grate. Then Lady Evelyn whispered, "Mary Scott, his wife." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, and this was written to Sir Reginald by someone who knew the truth of her death. But not her husband, I think. No, this letter was meant to torment, not warn. Someone else placed it there. Evelyn looked bewildered. But who? Miss Marple's voice was quiet. Perhaps the same person who wanted the doctor's guilt to seem complete. A faint knock interrupted them. Inspector Craddock entered, his face drawn but alert. "Ah, Miss Marple, I had a feeling I'd find you here. Lady Evelyn, forgive the intrusion. There's something you should both know. Dr. Scott's cell was found empty this morning." "He's gone!" Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Gone? But how?" "He escaped some time before dawn," Craddock said grimly. No sign of struggle. "The warder swears he was asleep at his post. The man can't have gone far, but there's heavy fog on the roads. We've got men searching the woods." Miss Marple set the letter gently on the table. "I think you'll find he hasn't gone far at all, Inspector. He still has something unfinished here." Craddock turned to her sharply. "You mean he might come for Lady Evelyn?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, not for her. For the truth. He said he meant to cure a sickness that medicine could not treat. Perhaps he realized too late that he'd only worsened it. If guilt drove him once, remorse may drive him now. I believe he will try to confess something that even his written statement concealed." Evelyn shivered. "You think he'll return here?" "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "but not to harm, to end it properly." The rest of the day passed in a strained quiet. The police combed the countryside, but the fog swallowed everything, lanes, hedges, even the sound of their calls. By nightfall, no trace of the doctor had been found. Miss Marple remained at the manor, at Craddock's insistence, in case the fugitive appeared. Lady Evelyn stayed upstairs, too restless to eat or rest. The servants had all retreated to their quarters, whispering of ghosts and madmen. It was near midnight when Miss Marple heard the faint creak of the back door. She had been sitting in the drawing-room, her knitting idle in her lap, her thoughts as taut as the thread between her fingers. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate opening, followed by footsteps on the tiled floor. She rose and moved quietly toward the hall. The figure that emerged from the shadows was unmistakable even in the dim light. Dr. Scott looked older, worn down by something more than fatigue. His clothes were damp, his hands trembling slightly as he closed the door behind him. "I knew you'd be here," Miss Marple said softly. He smiled faintly. "You always do, don't you? You've come to finish something," she said, "but not what the police think." He nodded, his voice low and tired. "I thought killing him would bring peace, that it would balance the scales for Mary, but it didn't." "The letter, did you find it?" "Yes," she said. "But you didn't write it." "No," he whispered. "She did. Before she died, she found out what he'd done, how he'd ruined her father to cover a debt. She wrote that letter, but she never sent it. I found it among her papers after she passed. I meant to destroy it, but I couldn't. It was her truth." "And you placed it in his desk," Miss Marple said quietly. He looked up at her, eyes hollow. "I wanted him to know before he died that she remembered, that she forgave everyone but him. But I never meant—" He broke off, his breath shaking. "Tell Evelyn I'm sorry. I thought I was saving her from cruelty. I only passed it on." Before she could speak, the distant sound of footsteps and shouts echoed outside. The doctor straightened, a strange calm settling over him. "It's all right, Miss Marple. They'll take me now, and perhaps at last I'll see her again." He turned toward the door just as the police lanterns flared through the fog. When they led him away moments later, he went quietly, his figure swallowed by the mist. Miss Marple stood alone in the doorway, the damp air brushing her face. She thought of Mary Scott's letter, of love twisted by grief, and of how often the pursuit of justice left only sorrow behind. As the last light faded into darkness, she whispered softly, "The heart again, always the heart." The following morning the fog had lifted, but the air over St. Mary Mead still felt heavy, as though the mist had left behind a residue of unease. Life in the village was already returning to its familiar rhythm. Children walking to school, postmen whistling through their routes, and shopkeepers sweeping the steps before opening their doors. But beneath the surface hum of daily life lay a quiet awareness that something dark had passed through them, leaving faint fingerprints no amount of sunlight could quite erase. Miss Marple sat by her parlour window, gazing out at the dew-bright garden, her thoughts drifting between what had been resolved and what had not. Dr. Scott had been taken into custody without incident. Craddock had called late the previous night to confirm that the doctor had confessed fully, including his tampering with the tonic and his placement of Mary Scott's letter in Sir Reginald's desk. Yet Miss Marple was not satisfied. Confession, she had often reflected, was not the same as truth. It was merely what the guilty believed they must say to find peace. And there was something in Dr. Scott's final words, his quiet insistence that he had meant to cure a sickness that medicine could not treat, that still disturbed her. It suggested something more than vengeance, something hidden in the tangled web of love, guilt, and retribution that had long preceded the fatal garden party. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of the morning post. Among the usual circulars and correspondence was an envelope without a return address, its handwriting oddly deliberate, as if written by someone unaccustomed to holding a pen. She turned it over and opened it carefully. Inside was a short note. "Miss Marple, there is something you must see before it is too late. I cannot trust the police. Meet me at St. Luke's churchyard before sunset. M.T. Mabel Turner again." The poor girl had already endured more than enough, and Miss Marple felt a pang of concern. The writing was shaky, but the words carried determination. Whatever had driven Mabel to such secrecy must have been serious indeed. Miss Marple wasted no time. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and set off down the lane. The path to St. Luke's wound through the edge of the village, past hedgerows glistening with moisture and the faint scent of hawthorn. When she arrived at the churchyard, the bell was tolling faintly for morning prayers. The graves lay in ordered rows, their stones greened by moss and thyme, and the stillness was broken only by the sound of a blackbird among the yews. Mabel was already there, standing near an older section of the churchyard where the grass grew wild. Her face was pale, but her eyes were resolute. "Thank you for coming, ma'am," she said, clutching her coat. "I wouldn't trouble you if it weren't important. Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "You did quite right. Now tell me, what is it you found?" Mabel hesitated, glancing around nervously. "It's about Lady Evelyn," she whispered. "There's something you don't know, something no one does. The night before the party, I was bringing up the tea tray when I heard voices from the study. I thought it was just Sir Reginald and the lady, but when I passed the door, I heard a man's voice too. I swear it was Dr. Scott. He was angry, really angry, and he said, 'If you don't tell her, I will.' Then the lady started to cry, I went straight upstairs, but later I heard her leave the house. She didn't come back till nearly midnight." Miss Marple frowned. "You're certain it was the doctor?" Mabel nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I've heard him often enough to know his voice. And there's more. Yesterday, before they took him away, he sent me a message through one of the constables. Told me to look in the vestry at St. Luke's, beneath the chest with the hymn books. I didn't tell anyone, but I went early this morning and found this." She handed Miss Marple a folded page, yellowed and creased. It was another letter, written in the same hand as Mary Scott's note from the desk. "To whoever finds this, forgive what I have done. The truth is heavier than sin, and I can no longer bear it. My husband does not know everything. I once went to Sir Reginald for help. He promised me assistance and betrayed me instead. What happened after was my own doing, though not mine alone. If I die before this is known, then let it be said, Dr. Scott is innocent of my death. The poison was mine, but the reason was his cruelty." Mary Scott Miss Marple read it twice, her mind working through the implications. This letter changed everything. It suggested that Mary's death had been not by natural causes, nor wholly at her husband's hand, but by her own. And if that were true, then Dr. Scott's revenge had been built upon a falsehood, a tragedy compounded by misunderstanding. "Mabel," she said softly, "you've done something very brave, but we must take this to Inspector Craddock at once." The girl looked frightened. "Will they think I've done wrong, hiding it? No, my dear. You've done exactly what was right. But this letter may yet save more than one person's soul." When they arrived at the station, Craddock was poring over a stack of reports, his usual briskness worn thin. Miss Marple handed him the letter without a word. As he read, his brows drew together. "Good Lord," he muttered. "If this is genuine, then Scott's entire confession is nonsense. He wasn't avenging his wife. He was deceived into believing he had to." "Grief makes poor detectives of us all," Miss Marple said gently. "He saw guilt where there was only despair. Perhaps that is why he spoke of curing a sickness no medicine could treat. He was trying to heal his own delusion." Craddock sighed heavily. "We'll have to verify the handwriting, but if this holds, Scott's motive collapses. Still, the law won't take kindly to a man who's poisoned another, whatever the reason." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Perhaps, but the law may take mercy where the truth softens judgment, and truth, Inspector, has a way of arriving at the 11th hour." He gave a tired smile. "You always manage to find it, don't you? That, my dear Craddock," she said, rising, "is because truth, like weeds, insists on growing in the least convenient places." By late afternoon, the news had spread through the village. Dr. Scott's sentence postponed. New evidence discovered. Lady Evelyn, when informed of the letter, wept silently, but said nothing. She had retreated into quiet solitude, neither condemning nor forgiving. Mabel, relieved but still shaken, stayed with a relative in the next parish. And Miss Marple, though praised discreetly by the inspector, returned home with no sense of triumph that evening. As twilight deepened over the garden, she sat by her window with her knitting untouched, listening to the faint toll of St. Luke's bell. The story was over, yet its echoes still stirred faintly in her mind. A woman betrayed had taken her own life. A man blinded by grief had become a murderer in the name of love. And another woman, too trusting, had nearly lost her freedom to their ghosts. When the knock came at her door, soft but steady, she almost expected it. Inspector Craddock stood there, hat in hand. "We've confirmed the letter," he said quietly. "It's authentic. He didn't know. He believed she'd been driven to death, not that she'd taken it by choice. He's calm now, resigned. Told me to thank you for giving him back the truth. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "He may yet find peace, then." Craddock hesitated. "There's one thing that puzzles me. Why leave the letter hidden all this time? Why not destroy it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because she wanted it to be found. The dead often do. They wait for the right hands to uncover what the living cannot bear to say." When he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair and gazed once more at the garden. The moon had risen, casting the roses in a soft, ghostly light. She thought of Mary Scott, of her quiet suffering, and of all the small tragedies that began not with malice, but misunderstanding. Human nature, she murmured to herself, never ceases to surprise and seldom to improve. Then, with a weary sigh, she took up her knitting once more, the steady rhythm of her needles soft against the silence, as though restoring order to a world that, for all its folly, continued to turn. The days that followed seemed to blur together in a quiet haze, as if the village itself were trying to forget the violence that had shaken it. St. Mary Mead resumed its familiar rhythms, the clatter of milk bottles on the step, the soft chiming of bicycle bells. But the undercurrent of whispering had not entirely vanished. People spoke of Dr. Scott's confession and the miraculous discovery of the letter, though each retelling carried its own embellishment. To some he was a monster, to others a tragic man ensnared by grief. Only Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting and her tea, understood that he was both and neither. Human nature, she reflected, was rarely so simple as good or evil. It was a tapestry of the two, woven too tightly to separate cleanly. On the third morning after the revelation, a light rain fell, the kind that left the hedges sparkling and the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Miss Marple was just finishing her breakfast when she saw Inspector Craddock's motor car pull up to the gate. He entered with his usual briskness, but there was a note of hesitation in his voice when he greeted her. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat and shaking off the rain. "I hope I'm not intruding, but something's come up that you ought to know." "You never intrude, Inspector," she said kindly. "Please sit down. You look as though the morning's work hasn't been kind to you." He smiled faintly and accepted the cup of tea she poured. "I wish it were just paperwork. No, it's about the Scott case. Or rather, something that's turned up in the aftermath. The letter from Mary Scott has stirred up old business. It seems Sir Reginald had more to hide than we realized." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "More to hide?" "Yes, the solicitor, Mr. Penrose, has been sorting through the estate's papers. He discovered a second account book, one that Sir Reginald kept hidden even from his wife. There are irregularities, payments made under an alias. It looks as though he was involved in some sort of blackmail arrangement, though we haven't yet traced the recipient. The first entry dates back nearly 2 years before Mary Scott's death." Miss Marple set her cup down carefully. 2 years? That would be shortly after her marriage, wouldn't it? Craddock nodded. "Exactly. Penrose believes Sir Reginald was paying someone connected to the Scotts, perhaps to keep a scandal quiet." Miss Marple's eyes clouded with thought. "And yet the payments stopped abruptly, let me guess, around the time of Mary's death." "Yes," said Craddock, his voice grim. "The last payment was made 3 weeks before she died." She was silent for a long moment, the rain whispering softly against the window. "I wonder," she said at last, "whether Mary Scott truly acted alone in taking her life. That letter she wrote, its phrasing was deliberate, almost too deliberate. It exonerated her husband but condemned Sir Reginald, and yet she called her death her own doing, though not hers alone. Those are not the words of a woman resigned. They are the words of someone aware of manipulation. Craddock frowned. "You mean someone else might have urged her toward it?" "Perhaps not urged," Miss Marple said slowly, "but guided, subtly, cruelly. It would not be the first time a clever man used another's despair for his own ends. I dare say Sir Reginald found her vulnerability quite useful. He had, after all, an unfortunate gift for making others feel indebted or ashamed. Craddock leaned forward. Then you think he might have been blackmailing her? Not her directly, Miss Marple replied, but possibly her husband. Imagine Dr. Scott discovers something in his wife's past, or perhaps she confesses something she believes terrible. Sir Reginald offers help for a price. When the payments grow impossible, Mary takes her own life. The guilt consumes the doctor, and years later, when he sees Sir Reginald again, he mistakes vengeance for justice. It all fits rather neatly, don't you think? The inspector sat back, exhaling. It fits too well. Still, the man's dead now, and his crimes can't be tried. I'll see that Penrose sends the books to London for review, but I imagine the matter will end there. Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, but the dead have a way of leaving unfinished business, and Sir Reginald was not the only one whose hands were not entirely clean. Craddock gave her a questioning look, but she merely smiled. You'll see, Inspector. If the truth has roots, it will find its way up eventually. That evening, the rain cleared and the sky turned pale gold. Miss Marple decided to take a short walk to clear her mind. The air was cool and sweet, and the lane glistened underfoot. As she passed the churchyard, she noticed a figure standing by the gates. Lady Evelyn, dressed in mourning black. Her head bowed. Miss Marple hesitated, then approached quietly. "My dear," she said softly, "you'll catch your death standing here in the damp." Evelyn turned, her eyes red but calm. "I was saying goodbye," she murmured. "To him, to all of it. They're moving me to my cousin's estate in Devon next week. I can't stay here, not after everything." "I can quite understand," Miss Marple said gently. "Sometimes the walls of a place remember too much." Evelyn nodded, then hesitated. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking about something. The night before the garden party, when I told you I heard voices in the study, there was something else. After Dr. Scott left, Reginald made a telephone call. I didn't hear all of it, only fragments. But I remember one thing very clearly. He said, 'It's done then? Good. She won't trouble anyone again.' I thought at the time he meant some business affair. But now, Miss Marple's eyes met hers. Now you think he was speaking of Mary Scott." Evelyn shivered. "Yes, I'm sure of it. I didn't realize until I heard what the inspector found in those account books. I think he was paying someone connected to her death, maybe to hide it or to keep them silent. Did you tell Inspector Craddock?" "I couldn't," Evelyn whispered. "If it comes out, Reginald's name will be dragged through the papers again. I want it to end. I want it all to end." Miss Marple reached out and took her hand. "My dear, things seldom end simply because we wish them to. But the truth, once buried, has a habit of growing thorns. Best to face it now, before it pricks you later." Evelyn smiled faintly through her tears. "You make even tragedy sound like gardening." "Well," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling, "the same principles apply. I've always thought." As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple's mind turned over the fragments once more. The payments, the letter, the final phone call. A picture was beginning to emerge, though it was still blurred at the edges. She had the uneasy sense that Sir Reginald's schemes had reached further than anyone suspected, and that the full truth had not yet surfaced. That night, sleep eluded her again. Near midnight, she rose, wrapped herself in her shawl, and sat by the window. The village lay silent beneath the moonlight, each house dark and still. But her thoughts were restless. She recalled Evelyn's trembling voice, the echo of Reginald's words. "She won't trouble anyone again." There was someone else in that sentence, another player still hidden in the shadows of the past. someone who had profited from Sir Reginald's manipulations. Her eyes drifted toward the vicarage beyond the hedge, where a single light still burned in the study window. The Reverend Clement was likely preparing his Sunday sermon, though the hour was late. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Even virtue, she thought, could be obsessive in its own way. But as she turned back toward the quiet street, her gaze caught on a figure moving near the gate. A fleeting shadow, too deliberate to be imagined. It paused, then vanished into the trees. Miss Marple's heartbeat quickened, but she made no move to call out. Instead, she watched, her mind calm and methodical, even as her pulse quickened. Something was stirring again in St. Mary Mead, something unfinished, and she knew, with the certainty born of long experience, that the final chapter of the Manor House affair had not yet been written. Miss Marple remained by the window long after the shadow had disappeared into the trees, her sharp eyes fixed on the spot where the faint rustle of leaves still whispered through the night air. The movement had not been random. It had the careful, deliberate rhythm of someone who knew how to move unseen. In St. Mary Mead, that was no small feat. People here noticed everything, and shadows were seldom left unremarked upon. Yet whoever that figure was, they had slipped away into the hedgerows as if swallowed by the dark. She stood quietly for a moment, her thoughts turning over like slow clockwork. There was a weight to that brief glimpse. The sense that some unfinished thread had stirred once more. She had learned to trust such instincts. They seldom misled her. As the night deepened, the moon slid behind the clouds, and the faint hum of distant wind through the trees filled the silence. Miss Marple, with the patience of one long accustomed to waiting, sat down again by her small fire. She did not stir until the clock on the mantelpiece struck 3. Only then did she rise, make a note in her little blue notebook, figure by Vicarage Gate, 12:45, and finally retire to bed. By morning, the village was alive again with its usual chatter. Mrs. Price was seen exchanging excited whispers with the baker about the escaped lunatic doctor, though Dr. Scott was still quite firmly under guard. Others speculated about ghosts, for St. Mary Mead had always harboured a fondness for the supernatural whenever the ordinary became too disturbing. Miss Marple, however, preferred her mysteries grounded firmly in human frailty. It was a far more reliable cause of mischief. After breakfast, she decided to call upon the vicar, ostensibly to return a borrowed hymnal. The Reverend Clement greeted her warmly, his kind, weary face brightening with polite surprise. "Miss Marple, up and about so early. Do come in, my dear. The kettle's just boiled." "Thank you, Mr. Clement," she said, stepping into the study. The familiar scent of old books and pipe tobacco hung in the air. "I thought I'd return this before Sunday. I know how particular Mrs. Clement is about keeping everything in its place." He chuckled. Quite right, quite right. She keeps the parish more orderly than I ever could." Miss Marple smiled and accepted a cup of tea, her eyes quietly scanning the room. The vicar's study faced the lane and the churchyard beyond. It would have offered a perfect vantage point for anyone wishing to move unseen along the hedge where she had seen the figure last night. "Tell me, Mr. Clement," she said casually, stirring her tea, "were you working very late last night? I saw a light in your study when I happened to be awake." He frowned, setting down his cup. "Late? No, not especially. I retired around 11, I think. I sometimes leave the lamp burning if I've been reading. Why do you ask?" "Oh, nothing, she said lightly. "Only that I thought I saw someone passing your gate around midnight. A trick of the moonlight, perhaps." The vicar looked puzzled. At that hour? Most unlikely, unless it was one of the constables making his rounds. Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "Yes, perhaps. Or perhaps not." As she left the vicarage, she paused by the gate, studying the hedge. There were faint marks in the soft earth. Boot prints, not large but distinct. She crouched slightly, noting the heel pattern. It was narrow, pointed, a woman's shoe, and quite recent. The impression was clear enough to suggest it had been made only hours earlier. When she returned home, she found Inspector Craddock waiting on her doorstep. His expression was grim but alert. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "We've had a development." "Ah," she said, ushering him in. "I rather thought we might." Craddock sat, glancing toward her mantelpiece before speaking. The prison van carrying Dr. Scott to London was attacked on the road near Little Stanning. Not a robbery, too precise for that. The guards were overpowered by chloroform. "The doctor's missing." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. How extraordinary! And none of the guards saw who did it. "Not clearly," Craddock said. "One claims he saw a woman near the roadside before the fumes overcame him, dressed in dark clothing, face covered by a scarf. We found tire tracks nearby, but no vehicle." Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. "A woman, you say? How very interesting. I believe she may have been in the village last night." The inspector leaned forward. "You saw her?" "Not clearly. A shadow near the vicarage gate, just after midnight. Too slender for a man, too purposeful for chance. And this morning I found footprints, women's shoes made quite recently." Craddock swore softly under his breath. "That settles it then. Someone helped him escape." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly, "but not necessarily out of affection. Guilt, maybe, or desperation." The inspector frowned. "You think she might be planning to silence him?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that whoever she is, she knows something about the past that she cannot bear to let surface. And now that the truth has begun to stir, she has decided to act." By afternoon, the village was crawling with constables, though they kept their presence as discreet as possible. Miss Marple spent the day tending to her garden, though her thoughts were far from her roses. Shortly before dusk, as the light turned amber over the fields, Mabel Turner appeared at her gate again, looking pale and frightened. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's terrible," she cried. "They say the doctor's gone, that he's run off. But he hasn't, I know he hasn't. He wouldn't leave like that, not without telling me." "My dear," Miss Marple said soothingly, "sit down and tell me everything." Mabel wrung her hands. "Last night I had a note pushed under my door. It said he must be freed. Go to him before it's too late." I didn't recognize the handwriting, but I thought it might be from Lady Evelyn. She's been strange lately, quiet, secretive. And today, when I went to the Manor, they told me she'd gone out early and hasn't returned. Miss Marple's knitting slipped from her lap. "Gone, did she say where?" "No, ma'am. Her maid said she left in a motor car around 7 this morning. She looked pale but calm." Miss Marple stood abruptly. "Mabel, fetch Inspector Craddock at once. Tell him Lady Evelyn may be heading toward Little Stanning, the same road the prison van took." Within the hour, Miss Marple and the inspector were in his motor car, speeding along the narrow lanes that curved toward the downs. The fading light turned the hedgerows into walls of shadow. Just beyond the bend where the van had been attacked, Craddock slowed suddenly. "Look there," he said, pointing ahead. A small motor car was parked by the roadside, half hidden behind an oak. The driver's door stood open. As they approached, Miss Marple saw Lady Evelyn kneeling beside a figure sprawled on the grass. It was Dr. Scott. His face was pale, but he was breathing. Evelyn's hands were stained with dirt where she had tried to drag him toward the car. When she saw them, she rose shakily. "I didn't do it," she whispered. "I found him like this. Someone struck him." Craddock moved quickly, checking the man's pulse. "He's alive," he said, relief in his voice. "We'll get him to the hospital." Miss Marple stepped closer to Evelyn. "My dear," she said quietly, "why did you come here?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "I got a letter this morning. It said he was in danger, that if I wanted to know the full truth about my husband's death, I had to come. It was signed with an initial R. I thought it might be a cruel trick, but I couldn't ignore it." Miss Marple's eyes darkened. "R. Denby." Evelyn looked startled. "Denby? But he's been gone for years." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but his name has been used before, has it not? To sow confusion and cover deceit. I think someone wanted to draw you here, and perhaps to ensure the doctor would not live to speak again." As Craddock's men lifted Dr. Scott onto a stretcher, Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the trees beyond the road. The wind had risen again, stirring the branches like whispers. Somewhere out there, the shadow moved still. The same quiet intelligence that had orchestrated Reginald's ruin, and now sought to bury the last remnants of truth. When they returned to the village that night, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, the events of the day circling her mind like the turning of a clock. The mystery was nearly done, but not quite finished. There was one final piece left to uncover, one final deception that had threaded through every act of kindness, every betrayal. She poured herself a cup of tea and murmured to the empty room, "It is always the quiet ones, the ones who seem least capable of deceit. They watch, they wait, and they strike when the world has looked away." Then, as the wind sighed through the chimney, she added softly, "Tomorrow I shall speak to Mr. Penrose." The following morning brought a pale sun that filtered gently through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting faint patterns over her writing desk. She had slept very little, though her restlessness was not from fear, but from clarity. The threads of the case, tangled for so long, had finally begun to pull taut. There was one conversation left to have, one quiet confrontation that would draw the truth from hiding, and she had no doubt where to find it. By mid-morning she was walking toward the offices of Arthur Penrose, solicitor and trustee, his name displayed in neat brass letters upon the door. The bell gave a discreet chime as she entered. Inside, the air was still and smelled faintly of paper, ink, and polish. Penrose looked up from his desk, his spectacles catching the light. "Miss Marple," he said with a thin smile, "what an unexpected pleasure. I was just reviewing some correspondence related to the late Sir Reginald's estate. How may I be of service? You might indulge an old woman with a few questions," she said pleasantly, taking the offered chair. "I've been thinking a good deal about Sir Reginald's affairs. Those hidden accounts Inspector Craddock found, for instance. Quite a puzzle, really. Payments made to a name we thought belonged to a dead man." He regarded her steadily, though his fingers stilled over the papers. "Yes, a peculiar matter. I believe the inspector intends to forward everything to the authorities in London. I'm merely tidying up the loose ends. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, but that's the difficulty with loose ends, isn't it? They have a dreadful habit of unravelling more than one expects. You see, I've come to realize that the Denby accounts were not blackmail at all. They were payments to you." For a brief moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then Penrose gave a soft, incredulous laugh. "To me, my dear lady, really—" "Oh, don't trouble to deny it," she said kindly. "I can quite understand. Sir Reginald was many things, but generous was not one of them. You handled his legal affairs for years, and I dare say you came to know his less reputable dealings rather too well. A man like that needs someone to manage his discretions, and a solicitor who looks the other way must be compensated for his efforts." His mouth tightened. "That's quite an accusation. Not at all. I make no moral judgment, only an observation. But then came Mary Scott's death, and with it an unexpected complication. Sir Reginald had used her tragedy to frighten the doctor, binding him in guilt. You, of course, managed the paperwork, ensuring the hush money was distributed properly. But when the Blakes married, your position changed. Sir Reginald began keeping more secrets than you controlled. And then, I imagine, you found something in Mary's letters, something that could destroy him completely. Penrose's voice, when he spoke, was very quiet. And what precisely do you think I did, Miss Marple? She folded her hands. You forged the letter that used the name R. Denby, the one that frightened Lady Evelyn into burning her husband's papers. You knew that if the letter surfaced after Sir Reginald's death, suspicion would fall upon Dr. Scott. It was the perfect diversion. You might even have thought yourself merciful, helping the lady escape scandal while ensuring no one ever looked too closely at the accounts. But there's one thing you did not anticipate. His expression remained unreadable. And what was that? That I should notice, she said gently. The writing on Mary Scott's original letter was done with a fountain pen, the kind women used in correspondence. Yours, on the other hand, leaves a finer, harder line, the sort used by solicitors for ledgers. You imitated her hand well enough for a quick glance, but not for an old woman with good eyes and a lifetime of mending embroidery. A shadow crossed his face, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he sighed and leaned back, as if something within him had quietly given way. "You're very perceptive, Miss Marple," he said at last. "I'd hoped, well, it hardly matters now. Yes, I wrote the letter. Reginald was on the verge of ruin. His dealings with the Scotts would have destroyed everything. I thought if I could bury it all, the rest would remain safe. But when he died, I realized what I had done. I never meant for it to reach this." Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "You may not have meant for it, but meaning seldom spares us from consequence. You set in motion the very chain that led to murder." He lowered his gaze. "Will you tell the inspector?" "I will tell him the truth," she said softly, "that you falsified evidence, but not that you killed anyone. You are guilty of cowardice, not cruelty." He looked up sharply, eyes glistening. "And the money?" "Return it," she said simply. "To the village charity. Sir Reginald owed them enough already." When she left his office, the sun had risen higher, burning off the last of the morning haze. The streets of St. Mary Mead were bright again, the ordinary life of the village restored. She paused outside the churchyard gate, where the first snowdrops were beginning to bloom among the moss. Life, she reflected, had a way of reclaiming even the darkest ground. Later that afternoon, she took tea with Inspector Craddock, who listened quietly as she recounted her conversation with Penrose. "So that's the end of it," he said finally. "A forgery to hide corruption, a murder born of guilt, and half the village tangled in secrets." "Quite so," she agreed. "But it all began, as such things often do, with something very small. A letter, a misplaced kindness, a silence that went on too long. Evil seldom arrives with thunder, Inspector. It grows quietly in the corner where decency looks away." He smiled faintly. "You make it sound almost inevitable." "Not inevitable," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Only human." That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the kettle humming softly beside her. The case of the manor house was over. Lady Evelyn had left for Devon that morning, seeking, as she'd said, a place where memory doesn't follow so quickly. Mabel Turner had found work with a family in Bath, her spirit mending with distance. Dr. Scott, though confined, would likely face leniency once the truth of the forgery became known. And as for Mr. Penrose, he had quietly resigned, leaving behind an anonymous donation to the Church Restoration Fund. Miss Marple reached for her knitting, the familiar rhythm of the needle soothing the final restlessness from her mind. Outside, the last light of day faded over the village roofs, leaving the world wrapped in peace once more. Yet even in that peace, she felt the lingering echo of all that had passed. The quiet reminder that in every heart, even the most respectable, there lurked the seeds of folly and deceit. As she sipped her tea, she smiled faintly to herself and murmured, "People will never change, not really. They only hide their natures better with each passing generation." And then, with the calm satisfaction of one who has once again restored order to a small corner of the world, Miss Marple bent her head to her knitting. The fire crackled softly, the clock ticked on, and beyond the window St. Mary Mead slept, peaceful for now, until the next whisper of human mischief found its way to her door.